Good morning and welcome to the Brazil-Canada Mining Insights, Human Rights and ESG, the fifth session of the second Brazil-Canada Virtual Mining Conference, which will bring a series of important discussions on regulatory framework, capital markets, ESG, diversity and inclusion, exploration, smart mining innovation, mining financing, among others. And it's taking place virtually until May 31st in preparation for the 16th Brazil-Canada Conference at PDAC 2022 that will happen in person in Toronto between June 13th and June 15th. I'm Carolina Alberna, CEO of the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce, and I'll be your MC today. The platform you're in provides also the opportunity to connect with your peers, colleagues, and professionals from the mining sector from all over the world. So don't be shy, and before and after the event, go to the networking tab and check out who else is here online with us. There's also a matchmaking tool available for you. Meaningful connections can happen online, so let's make the best of it. Before we start, I'd like to share a few reminders. The discussions today will be in English. We're offering simultaneous translations for the whole program, and you can access the Portuguese channel by switching the language in the interpreter icon on the bottom right side of your Zoom screen. Estamos oferecendo tradução simultânea. As apresentações de hoje serão em inglês, mas você pode acessar o canal de português através do ícone de tradução simultânea na parte de baixo da sua tela. You'll be able to ask questions to the panelists as the discussions happened. Please use the Q&A box in the Zoom screen to send questions to our speakers. We do our best to answer all the questions during the session. If there's any questions that cannot be answered live, we'll revert to you after the event. We have a packed agenda for today with two very important panel discussions. The first one, moderated by Juliana Ramalho, partner at Mattos, Filho, will address Indigenous and traditional communities relations in mining and has among panelists Cassio Ingles de Sousa, Brazilian Anthropologist at Comtexto Consultoria, Victoria Barrington, Head of Corporate Affairs at Vale based Mattos, and Lana, founder at Lana Consulting. The second one, Simone Rocha, Senior Specialist at Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs at Proativa, will facilitate a conversation about human rights due diligence in mining with Kendio Salcito, Executive Director at Nomogaya, and Fadwa Mohamedied, CSR and Human Rights General Manager at Norsk Hydro Brazil. So without further ado, I would like to invite Rafael Benke, CEO and founder at Proativa Results and chair of the BCCC ESG committee for the initial remarks. Rafael, welcome, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for the opening and for all the good work at the chamber and also in support of the ESG committee. So I'm opening today's event as the chair of the ESG committee of the BCCC. I would like to invite the panelists that are already with us to open their cameras at their will, so that we put names to faces and faces to names. So thank you very much to be with us. I believe some of you who have been following the works of the ESG committee are probably noticing the step-by-step introduction of subjects that we have been having through the ESG committee. I think the key, one of the main purposes of the creation of this committee in the Brazil-Canada Chamber was exactly to bring to the general public, not only the Brazilian and the Canadian public, but the public at large, quality discussions around social, environmental, and respective governance for better sustainability, right? We've named it ESG committee not by accident, but because we believe that especially the last 3 years, the shift we've had in terms of attention to ESG references have been a major lever of progress for the sustainability agenda. And the effort we've been doing in the ESG committee in our discussions is to connect and integrate these discussions. So we see a lot of people saying ESG is just a new clothing or a new wave of something that always existed. And there is some truth to it, to the extent that, yes, sustainability aspects have been developing for literally decades, right? And the people we have here at the table have been part of this for way before ESG has been used more frequently as currently. Having said that, I think it is very important that we acknowledge the shift that we are experiencing, and especially the arrival of capital in this story, right? I think the relevance that the financial institutions, the financial players are now dedicating to it, and how much they are, exactly because of the sustainability evolution we had, all the tools that are already at their disposal, so that they can better assess, better reference their work, so that they do better investment, is really what we want to bring to the table. In this context, discussions as we have today, starting with a very hot topic around business and human rights, which is the relationship of business with indigenous peoples, of business with traditional communities, is one that deserves attention, right? And we are starting and kicking off with a fantastic panel, as Carolina was explaining. It will be moderated by Juliana, who has been following these topics for years, and with the participation of Cassio, Victoria, and Lana, who are old hands in this topic. So I think what we want here in this discussion, starting with indigenous peoples, traditional communities, is to enlighten all players that are caring about the ESG agenda, what is of relevance when we want to do the right thing. And the same will be for the second panel, because we want to highlight what is actually, what does it mean to really have a due diligence when I'm talking about business and human rights, right? And we see a lot of companies wanting to embark in this agenda in a more structured way. So it's very important that companies understand what is to embark in a structured way, in the right way, right? I think there is a very important factor, and then I will shift to Juliana to guide this panel, a very important factor we want to acknowledge in this shift that we saw in the last 3 years in this concept that some say of stakeholder capitalism, that one of the key stakeholders for any kind of operation is the human dimension to it. So when we talk about human rights, we bring a very specific type of stakeholder, which is the rights holder. So it's not just a simple stakeholder that has a stake on whatever activity I have or whatever territory and landscape I belong to, but this stakeholder is entitled to specific rights that have been developed for longer than the sustainability concept itself. So the understanding of this fusion, of this integration of these worlds is very important for any player. So if I am a company, and here the challenge for the panelists is to connect the indigenous component and the human rights component in a way that is understandable for business, But if I am a business leader, if I am an operator, I am inserting myself in a territory and I'm not alone. It's not a bubble, right? And in this understanding of stakeholders, I have to have a very specific understanding, even prior to my arrival, and which is this understanding around rights holders. So we will start with a very focus on Indigenous peoples, traditional communities, and then we'll talk more broadly on how I look at this specific dimension, but many others that are today on the table when we talk about business and human rights and the value of due diligence for that. I think we've progressed immensely in the last decade since the 2011 publication of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. There is still a long way to go, but what we see today already, Cassio, Victoria, Lana, Juliana, and we have already Simone and Kendall with us, is that companies, leaders, start to being judged about what they did 10 years ago by the lenses of what we understand today. So enlightened leaders today must act, because in 10 years, they won't be judged with today's lenses, but with the lenses of the future. So vision is not only nice to have, is a need, because you will be demanded and requested about that. I'm paraphrasing here Fábio Barbosa, who Juliana interviewed in a couple of weeks ago in a fantastic event. And this insight he brought, we practitioners are feeling every day. So operators, business leaders, practitioners in sustainability that are looking at this panel live or after in our recordings, let's think of this panel and the following panel with Simone, Kendall, and Fadwa, through these lenses of challenges, what we have today, thinking of what we have to be compliant with and achieved in 10 years from now, right? So with that, thank you again, Juliana, for accepting the invitation to moderate this panel. And also, thank you very much, Cassio, Victoria, and Lana, to be on board. Let me shift to you for the first panel, and then we come back for the second one in a bit. So good luck with the works. I'll be with you and eager to hear your thoughts. Juliana, over to you.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you for inviting me to this event and mostly to moderate such an important panel. Good morning to you all. Good morning, panelists. Good morning to attendees. Mining is an activity that is directly connected to the territory where mineral resources are available. And therefore, it's essential to respect the rights of the communities that live or use these territories. As Rafael just mentioned, they are stakeholders, and mostly they are right holders. Indigenous peoples and traditional communities have distinct rights and interests, and there are growing expectations that this will be respected by responsible companies. Indigenous peoples and traditional communities also have a special relationship to the land, which can create specific obligations for companies, as well as present a range of unique challenges and also opportunities that they need to be understood and addressed. And to discuss these challenges and opportunities, we have our three panelists. Lana and Victoria will give us the Canadian perspective, while Cassio will bring us the perspective of Brazil. The idea here is really to have a conversation, so please feel free to send questions and to our panelists to interact among yourselves as we discussed it before. So, starting with Canada. As I mentioned, Indigenous people have individual and collective rights, and these rights should be protected by governments and respected by companies, as the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights says. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, adopted by the UN in 2007, set out rights that countries should aspire to recognize, guarantee, and implement, and also establish a framework for discussion and dialogue between Indigenous people and states. Lana, I know that Canada have recently introduced a legislation respecting this declaration. Can you explain to us how was and how it's been this process, and also give an overview of the Canada landscape?
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm calling in today from the province of British Columbia, which is on the very west side of Canada. And I live and work in the city of Campbell River, which is located on the traditional territories of the Kwaika, the Wiiwkai, and the Wiiwikam peoples. So it's a beautiful part of the country. If you ever get a chance to visit Canada, please come to Vancouver and Vancouver Island, and you will be astonished at the beauty of the country that we live in. So yeah, it's been a long period of time, I think, for Canada's Indigenous people that we have lived under the Indian Act, under a system that really marginalizes us as Indigenous people. Across the country of Canada, there are over 660 different communities, different language speaking groups, not all different there's fewer language speaking groups, but there's many different communities, all at different levels of life, if you will, their quality of life. And some of it is really, compared to the rest of Canada, a really marginalized state of living. And we see these people living in poverty, lack of access to clean water, living off the grid, so to speak. So their power is fueled by diesel. So a very, very poor way of life. And mixed in with that is the social side. So there's lots of problems, around violence and social issues and lack of education. So this keeps building on itself, but there is a reason why we have encountered this kind of lifestyle, is because of what the government of Canada set out to do to us, and that is to extinguish us, to bring us into a way of life that was different than what Canada's Indigenous peoples lived, how they lived a century and a half ago. So through all of this, we have come through it. We have survived. We have shown our ability to continue on as a people. And so with that, during the times that we were relegated to reservations, Canada, the country of Canada, had access to everything that they wanted to, whether it was in mining or timber, accessing our wealth. But none of that was ever shared with its Indigenous peoples. So it took years, decades of Indigenous people wanting to be part of this, wanting to have a better way of life for their own. And our voices went unheard, our wanting to make a change didn't happen until recently. And I think it really was the few who continued to have a voice and wanting to create a better lifestyle and certainly better opportunities for our people. Those were the voices that continued to work and to bring us to the point where the government of Canada realized that, yes, we were marginalized, and yes, we were people that were living in these particular conditions. So during that time, and during people began to see, how we were, but always we were on the land, and always I think miners particularly began to understand that in order to mine particular projects, they had to find a way to work with Indigenous people. So before it became a legislated act, if you will, that you had to work with Indigenous people here in Canada, there were those that were pioneers that began that work early, long before we heard the words of reconciliation, long before we heard the words of inclusion. There were people, there were Canadians who understood and realized that it was a value proposition to work with Canada's Indigenous people. So we see good examples of that across our country, and it's continuing to grow daily because through this whole process, Indigenous people are realizing they have a voice and are wanting to have a seat at the economic table. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. It's non-Indigenous people understanding that they need to work with Indigenous people, and it's Indigenous people saying, you need to work with us. So this kind of approach has worked well. And one good example of that is in northwestern BC with the Tahltan people. And the Tahltan people occupy an area which is well known throughout the world as the Golden Triangle. And it's rich with all kinds of mineral resources. So companies are, exploring and beginning to develop mines and operating mines in that particular area. But the one thing that I think has led to their success has been that the Tahltan have developed a protocol that if you want to mine in this area, if you want to explore in this area, here's what you must do. And so what I'm seeing is that when companies, industry, and the government and Indigenous peoples all work together, good things can begin to happen. And so what is happening is that the Tahltan are setting an example of how mining can be done with protocols in place so that everyone can be successful. And the mining world, people like myself who often have discussions with different people, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, about their success, it is based on those relationships that are built between mining and Indigenous people. I think it's impossible to build a successful mine today without that kind of relationship in place, because now we know that with ESG, as my colleague mentioned earlier, it is growing, and more investors are having a say in how mines operate, in how they work with Indigenous peoples. So, if a mine chooses to ignore Indigenous peoples, it's your investors or people that have influence over investors can change their minds about investing in your particular company. So things are changing, but I think it's for the greater good of humanity. It's for the greater good of the people that are involved, that people that live in the area where a mine is located, people that work for a mining company that is mining in the traditional territory of an Indigenous community. And as that begins to change, we begin to create better societies and better countries. And I will make one more comment. I think the world became very much enlightened when what happened to Canada's Indigenous people when unmarked graves were being discovered and still are being discovered in Canada. And I think what that did was that shifted a lot of people's thinking, regular, normal Canadians who were not employed in the industry, who never really understood this whole, what is truth and reconciliation? Why are we even talking about it? But when we started to understand that children were needlessly dying at schools, people began to there was a sea change in people. And last year was our first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And there were a lot of employee groups who wanted to know, how do we become better Canadians? How can we be better? What can we do? What can we do to try to understand what happened to our Indigenous people? So these things happen because there are citizens that move forward, that try to make changes. And we see that in our industry today. And these things happen in the broader perspective because history starts to unveil itself, and people become more aware of why things are the way they are, and become aware that there needs to be a change of some sort. So I know I've rambled, but I think I've hit most of the points that I wanted to make, and I'm sure you have more questions.
Thank you, Lana. It was very enlightful what you just said. Thank you so much. And turning to Victoria. Victoria, you are in another position. You are at Vale. And I know Vale have policies, and those policies are also related to the importance of pay attention to the communities. What are the specific actions adopted by Vale to ensure the identification of Indigenous and traditional communities impacted by your activities, and the participation of such communities in the modeling of the mining projects?
Thank you very much. I definitely come to this, pardon me, I'm sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. I come to this from the other side, obviously, of the table, but I don't think that, and I certainly echo Lana's words. I think, you know, there is a definite partnership and relationship that companies need to build within Canada with Indigenous peoples. And my view has very much been that you can't rely on the government to mandate that for you. Companies need to take ownership of that. And companies, and certainly Vale, has been on what we very openly call a truth and reconciliation journey, which Lana was just mentioning before, which is and I completely agree with what she said, because I think that the recent discovery of Mark Graves, which is continuing today and will tragically continue well into the future, has really opened up a discussion beyond Indigenous peoples and companies who engage with them. It's really taken it to a conversation that all Canadians are having. And I think that there's so much opportunity for companies to support and further that discussion. Within Canada, we are definitely, Vale has operations across the country, specifically in Manitoba and Ontario and Newfoundland and Labrador. We are at different maturity levels in terms of our own agreements with Indigenous communities, and that's something that is a continuing journey for us. But really, it's about building a partnership model and building true partnership, true sustainable partnership, so that we're building capacity within the community and we are delivering to the community the specific needs that matter to them, whether it be recruitment, whether it be procurement and building capacity within local businesses, whether it be preservation of heritage languages, or whether it be, for instance, in Newfoundland and Labrador, I can, mental health is a huge issue with our Inuit communities in Newfoundland and Labrador. In fact, the suicide rate in Canada is 20 times higher in the Inuit communities out in Voisey's Bay, near our operations in Voisey's Bay. And so we are implementing programs specifically for that community on how to deal with mental health and how to get the support that they need. We've also implemented a suicide training with all of our supervisors at our sites to help support our Aboriginal employees, but as well our non-Indigenous employees too. So there are specific actions that we have and activities that we have in each area of our operations within Canada. But really, I would say the overall theme has been to continue to build a partnership that is meaningful and sustainable. Recruitment obviously is a large feature to that, and definitely procurement. And that is about building an economic partnership. And so does that look at revenue sharing? Does that look at some sort of profit model, but really trying to understand what is best in class, and so that we are giving the community, or we are not giving, but we are partnering with the community to build capacity, but also so that they have a share in the business. And we are all invested in the future of the business, and all invested in the future of the community, for sure. So, there are definitely specific actions. We've implemented an Indigenous training course, a cultural awareness course. We have specifically in Ontario, as part of our diversity and inclusion journey, we have Indigenous affinity groups and Indigenous employment groups, so that our Indigenous employees in Ontario and Manitoba have a place to gather. We also have specific feedback mechanisms as well, so that they can feed up to us, and our internal policies are meeting the needs of our Indigenous employees. Specifically out in Voisey's Bay, we have a really great recruitment program called the Career Awareness, so that we bring our Inuit employees to the site. They can spend a week with us and just see what it's like to be a miner, and see what it's like to live at a site, see what it's like to live at a camp, because our site in Newfoundland and Labrador is a fly-in, fly-out site. So people just, to bring the community and partner with them to come and see what it's like, and see whether that really works for them, and understand what a career in mining looks like. So it's a lot of, building a sustainable future, and that's something that we definitely want to do. The other thing that I'll just say, though, if I jump back to even before you've got all of these policies and programs in place, companies, and I say this about Vale as well, and we've certainly done this, but within the Canadian landscape, companies need to take ownership of consultation. In Canada, consultation with Indigenous communities is provincially governed. So in Manitoba, the process is different than it is in Ontario, than it is in Newfoundland and Labrador. Despite the process, companies need to take ownership of that consultation, and ownership with Indigenous communities. Companies can't wait to be told by the government, you need to speak to this community and have proper consultation with these specific communities. That is definitely the process, but I think companies need to take ownership of that relationship and that relationship building, so that we're not waiting for a third party like the government to dictate. And I think that's something that a lot of Canadian companies miss.
Perfect. Thank you, Victoria and Lana, for giving us this overview of Canada. Now turning a little bit to Brazil. Cassio, can you give us a brief overview of the Brazilian landscape regarding Indigenous and traditional communities, and trying also to address the bill that aims to authorize research and mineral extraction in Indigenous lands, and that have already been demarcated by the government? And we know there is a lot of discussion around this bill. So if you could address first the overview of our situation, and also why you have so many discussions around this bill.
Okay, thank you, Juliana. Thank you, everyone. Good morning to everybody. I'd like first to thank for the invitation for this so important seminar. And I would like to greet my colleagues, Victoria and Lana. Well, I'll try to answer. As a Brazilian anthropologist, I'm not Indigenous myself, but I choose to dedicate my life to work with Indigenous for the last 25 years. So this is the position that I will be talking about. To answer your question, Juliana, it's important to maybe think about what is the Indigenous context here in Brazil right now, and what kind of mining activity are we talking about. So as everywhere, in Brazil, diversity is a key word for Indigenous people. We have around 300 different Indigenous nations or peoples that speaks around 160 different languages. We have a population estimated in almost 1 million persons, indigenous persons, individuals. That is less than 1% of the Brazilian whole population. Well, actually, they are survivors of the colonial process. We have a different colonial process compared to Canada, but the ethnocide, the genocide is the same. So indigenous people right now are survivors of this process. We have also in Brazil a diversity of historical relationship with Brazilian society. We have indigenous that are still isolated on the forest. We have around 100 indigenous groups that are considered isolated. They run away from the contact with our society. They are monolingual. So this is a very special situation in Brazil, mainly at the Amazon region. And it's important for mining because some mining interest is close or is at the land occupied by these groups that doesn't have contact with our society. They are running away. And we have on the other side of this range, some indigenous people that lost their culture due to the colonial process of oppression. They are regaining their identity. We call it ethnogenesis. So we have a very complex and diverse historical situations of indigenous people. And we have the law changed in Brazil in 1988. So it's very recent and shifted very in a radical way the approach of indigenous peoples here in Brazil. Before 88, indigenous people were like relatively incapable. The Brazilian state had to be a tutor of indigenous people in Brazil. Indigenous people couldn't have their own organizations. They couldn't speak by themselves. So the Brazilian state used to represent indigenous peoples in Brazil. And this changed completely in 1988 and have many consequences in land demarcation, indigenous representation, etc. So it's a very recent shift. So let's talk about mining. What kind of mining are we talking about? We have the industrial mining, the legal mining, that is the main subject of this conference. But in Brazil, we also have the garimpos. It's not exactly an artisanal mining because they use machines and etc. But they are not under environmental mitigation activities, and the garimpos are inside indigenous lands as invaders or with some contact with indigenous leaders, but many invasions. On the recent years, this grow a lot, the presence of garimpos inside the indigenous land. And the industrial mining is located outside indigenous land, but due to an act, a decree, Portaria 60 of 2015, companies that are located nearby indigenous land are obligated to carry impact assessment studies specific to indigenous peoples. So two kinds of mining. On the indigenous perspective, their experience is closer to the garimpos. They doesn't have much experience related to industrial mining. So, and it causes invasion, rapes, and violence, and environmental degradation, huge problems at indigenous lands right now in Brazil. And this bill, this project of a new law 191 that tries to regularize the mining activity inside indigenous lands, that nowadays is not allowed, okay? It's very controversial. No? There is no dialogue between these, our current federal government and indigenous representatives. And this project was written by the government with no dialogue with the indigenous people. So the indigenous representatives say no to this project. And also the project doesn't respect free prior informed consent, basic procedures. And it's not clear because they may allow a kind of mining similar to garimpo inside the indigenous land. So this is not even a good law or project of law for big companies. And Vale just released the manifestation against this project of law. So that's it. I can answer more questions later to complement these thoughts.
Sure, thank you, Cassio. It's true that this bill is very controversial. I wanna take one thing that you just said. You mentioned free, prior, and informed consent, which is a specific right that pertains to indigenous people, and it's recognized by the UN. Lana, you told us that in Canada there are different rules for consultations. Can you explain to us these rules, and do you follow the free, prior, and informed consent? And how do you see the consent part? Because it's always a discussion on the consent part. Like, if you could explore a little bit this for us.
It's true what you just said. And I kind of smile because I find that people who might be not in favor of free, prior, informed consent will say it's a veto, that Indigenous communities have a veto, and that scares everybody. Especially, you know, explorers that are putting money into the ground. How can an Indigenous community have veto? And so that starts that conversation. And then on the other side of the table, we have Indigenous people that are saying free, prior, and informed consent is not a veto. So now it's kind of funny how the different sides defend their positions. So I think free, prior, informed consent does exist, but it is not a veto. And how you get around that is by not, as an industry, as a mining company, coming in and just telling, this is what we plan to do, and here's how we're going to do it. It has to start earlier. It has to start from the very beginning, when exploration is starting on the ground, and having those conversations and including Indigenous people. So I did receive a question, a direct question asking me about this. And I'll try to answer that, you know, as I'm answering your question. And really it involves consultation protocols. And so what does that really mean? Because I had used the word protocols earlier. And really what that means is a community should decide how they want to be engaged with, and what are the steps along the way, the milestones. So I know, for instance, with the small town, they expect that whoever you are, if you're a junior exploration or you're an operator intending to acquire a mineral claim and develop it, that you sign an agreement with the Tahltan called communication agreement. And then there's lots of different terms and things that they have to adhere to. But what it does is it brings the company into the way that the Tahltan want to manage that agreement, that relationship. And so they are light years ahead of other communities in Canada, in that they have a way to deal with this. And what's more interesting is just watching and observing different companies adhere to this protocol, because, you know, because the area is so prolific, and because there's you know, companies really do want to explore and hopefully develop someday. It's important to them to have that relationship, that social license to operate. And so I think we're going to start seeing this play out more across the country, where there is already exploration and mining taking place. So those become important. And in Canada, we refer to every group, every Aboriginal group as a nation, and it's just because First Nations or the Inuit want to be consulted with government to government. And so that nation approach is not necessarily for industry to adhere to, but it's more for the government, whether it's the provincial jurisdictions, the territorial jurisdictions, or the federal jurisdictions. And it's not just involving mining, it's everything else that the federal government is responsible for and the provincial governments are responsible for. So that whole notion of a nation to nation came into being well before this acknowledgement of free, prior, informed consent, this acknowledgement of a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But even so, there are still so many changes and that need to be made. So I'll give you one example. As you well know, across the globe, we are recognizing what critical minerals are. In Canada, in the last couple of years, has named the 31 critical minerals that we can supply the world with, in terms of creating batteries. So a lot of money in the last federal budget has been allocated to critical minerals. And I asked myself, to what extent did the federal government actually consult with Indigenous peoples about critical minerals? And I think I got my answer from a different source. And one of the companies that I do some work for was sharing with me that they received a letter from a community saying, basically, and I'll just summarize, we don't give a damn about this critical mineral stuff. You have to consult with us before we're going to let you on our land. That's kind of the tone of the letter. But, this is where we are. We can say we have all this wealth of riches, whether it's timber or whether it's mining, but we still can fail to consult with Indigenous peoples, with Indigenous nations. So my mantra has always been, it's so important to get in there early. And as my colleague Victoria has explained, that they have been building relationships with Indigenous peoples. And I know in our pre-webinar chat, she was saying, they're not perfect, but they still go about it. And it's like any relationship, whether it's a marriage or a friendship, it may not be a perfect relationship, but we work at it because we choose to. And that's kind of where we are. We choose to work at a relationship. And that's what will continue to go forward, how we will continue to go forward. And some people will really get it and others won't.
If I could just jump in, Juliana, I completely agree with Lana, your comments there. And I think for a lot of companies, are timid or afraid of criticism and don't want to have a combative relationship. And I think if you can approach it, building those relationships early and have open and transparent communication, and as a company and as a non-Indigenous run company, you have to be able to approach those conversations with humility and with an open heart and open ears. And I think and I think that is the only way that you're going to get to a mutually beneficial discussion about building a future together. And some of those conversations are tough. And I mean, as I've said to previous companies that I've worked with, and the relationships do this. As your relationships with your partner do that, and your relationships with your friends and your family do that, there's no reason to think that your relationships with the community will be any different. But together you can grow a really bright future. but that's listening to the needs of the community, and that's making sure that you really have that free and prior informed consent. And I think that's what when I mentioned earlier, taking ownership of that process as a company outside of the government. But when I say that, when I'm talking about that, I guess what I mean is certainly in, for instance, in Manitoba, you know, the government then dictates to us who we should speak to and when we should speak to them. And, you know, and to me, definitely follow that process. But oftentimes it's really about building that relationship right from the beginning so that you've got that foundation in place and you've already built that relationship. You've already started that discussion. You know, and I just think that that's so critical, and companies wait to be told what to do. And I think that they need to take ownership of their own relationships. It's something that I'm very proud that Vale has really done, particularly in Canada, and especially when you look at our operations in Voisey's Bay. But we are at different stages, and that is just because of, you know, and I think that that's just a normal course of business, and I think it's and I'm excited about the relationships that we're building together.
Victoria,
and if I may, Juliana, can I make one more comment? Yeah, and I think in hearing Victoria, I totally agree. But there's one word that I failed to mention, and Victoria was just about saying it, but not quite. The whole reason why we build relationships and why we want to build relationships is because we need to build trust.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that is the goal, is to build trust. And what is trust? It means that I can totally trust and put my faith in you because I believe what you say is true, because you've always been truthful to me. And, you know, a lot of Indigenous people haven't really experienced that feeling of trust. And so there's a lot of work to do. And that takes time. You know, when you need an agreement signed so that you can go ahead and get your permit, all of that, it's not going to happen in 3 months when you're building trust, unless you have the kind of people that can go in and be very trustful because they want to be. But it is a process. And so, you know, the Victorias of the world that work for different mining companies, if you want to move forward, you have to have people like that in your on your side to be that person that people can trust. But more importantly, you have to be trustworthy as well. So you know, one of my mentors, many of you may have heard of him, Chief Dr. Robert Joseph. When we talk about reconciliation, we have to ask ourselves individually, what can I do? And that's where it starts. It starts in the heart. And if that's the kind of people that you need, people that know and understand why it's important to build a relationship, why it's important to build trust, it's how we move forward. If you don't have that kind of person anything on your board or in your executive, or you don't have anything. I think it's harder. It's a much harder
and
process.
Trust requires information, knowledge, and open mind. Companies should learn more about Indigenous people, but, and this is very important here in Brazil, Indigenous people should learn more about companies, private sector, and mining activities, legal mining activities. And this is a gap here in Brazil because there is a taboo. Mining companies have, like, it's not comfortable to talk about with Indigenous peoples, and also Indigenous peoples and Indigenous representatives doesn't have a past experience to dialogue with companies, especially mining companies. It's always on conflicts. And because the environmental agenda is so important for Indigenous peoples in Brazil, it's more and more a taboo, the relationship with mining companies. But I believe, and I agree with you, that trust should be a building process to transform the table in a round table where everybody sit together and can talk in an equitable political way.
And I think that that's something that we've done, just to build on that, Cassio, you know, to make sure that everyone's coming to those conversations with the same level of knowledge. And that's sometimes really difficult for Indigenous communities that may not have participated in resource extraction and may not have had prior relationships with oil and gas or mining companies. And that's where, you know, and I've not had to do this at Vale, but it's certainly other companies that I've worked within Canada, is to, you know, help fund a third party that the Indigenous community decides and they find, but someone so that they trust and that they feel can help them come to the table and have those conversations and educate them what questions to ask of us, what demands to make, what you know, what is mining, and building that education and that capability level within the community, so that we're having this sort of open and transparent conversation. And sometimes that doesn't exist. So definitely, you know, that's part of the process is to help give them access to that.
Yeah, certainly.
Sorry, Juliana, I feel like we've taken you.
No. For me, it's fine. It's perfect. That's what we are looking for. Rafael, you want to talk?
Yes, thank you, Juliana. I'm learning a lot here from this discussion. It's been very, very interesting. I just wanted to take the opportunity to make a comment and bring a subject to the table for the panelists. And I think that connects to the opening remarks that we were doing on how we have to act today, thinking on how we'll be judged 5-10 years from now. And the point I would like to bring is, well, first of all, saying that, you know, the back and forth between Lana and Victoria about the spirits on how we should approach this dimension are very enlightening. And I think the comment that Cassio made on the top of that, saying about the need of information to build trust, the good information to build trust, is really fundamental. And then I would like to bring Juliana, to Lana, Victoria, and Cassio, a very fundamental point here that I will call the licensing trap, right? When we are starting mining activities, when a junior company will start its exploration activities, or a large corporation will start its mining activities, or even expand or continue its operations, it will be very worded with a word called compliance, right? And the question is, what is my reference for compliance? Is it the current legal framework in the jurisdiction where I am operating, right? And this legal framework is one that was developed through a legal process of years and of the past, right? And how much is this objective legal compliance of the moment in touch with the international best practice of the moment and of the future? So I would like to bring this legal trap issue, because we've been seeing this over and over more recently when the ESG lenses are coming to the table. We're seeing a very positive phenomenon that I would recognize as such, that financial institutions are requiring much more the spirit of what you, Lana, and Victoria are asking, and through the means that Cassio was highlighting, that just the traditional checkbox of standard legal compliance, right? So in this trap of licensing process, if we bring this to the Brazilian reality, we will, the first one will be, does the licensing process in the Brazilian state where I'm doing my business, does it request a consultation or not? Are these these indigenous communities really recognized formally by the government in the last necessary bureaucratic instance or not, right? Are they 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers from my mining pit? Because if they're 10, maybe I shouldn't care. If they're 5, so this goes to the point that Juliana raised on the buffer zones, the directly impacted areas or areas of influence more broadly, right? Or yet in this formalistic approach around indigenous communities, and we can amplify that also to traditional communities, do they have a government stamp, and do I disregard completely the self-recognition of these communities as indigenous peoples, irrespectively of a slow process of formal recognition by the government? So these traps are all there. And how should companies behave about that in a world beyond the traditional compliance? So we already see, right, Juliana, enlightened law firms already concerned about the beyond compliance. We see players concerned about beyond compliance, but we see enormous gray areas where a lot of companies are disregarding communities protected by the licensing trap, right? We are still not all the way there. So I would like to put this point at the table so that you stress a little bit what is the right thing to do, right? And how do we approach that? And you were talking a lot about that already, but I think if you could stress the beyond compliance, the licensing trap, in the current world of sustainability, ESG that we are living. Sorry to expand, it was a comment attached to a question, but if we could put this important point at the table.
Maybe I'll answer from the Canadian context and then hand it over to Lana from, and then maybe Cassio, if that works. But essentially you have two compliance, I would say, major avenues that you have to follow. Obviously, you have to follow the government of Canada's process, or and certainly the provincial government process. But then you have to follow also the process in the accommodation protocol, which is something that Lana was mentioning earlier, which is the consultation protocol, which a lot of First Nations in Canada now have, thanks to the hard work of some of the First Nations like the Tahltan. Now, there's a difference in Canada between treaty lands and traditional lands, and that's important to know. So for instance, in our Sudbury operations, they overlap 4 First Nations and 1 Métis of their traditional lands. So there's not a specific, it's not done by boundary of how close is this First Nation to your operation. It's done by more of a traditional land as deemed by the First Nation. So for instance, another mining company that I worked with in Northern Ontario, our primary First Nation that we built a partnership with, Moose Cree First Nation, was over 500 kilometers away from our operation. But that's not to say that they weren't impacted by their traditional lands. So that's a very different process, I think, than Brazil. But that's something that Canadian companies need to understand, that it's not by treaty land, so to speak. It's or a specific boundary. It's by traditional lands as deemed by the First Nation. And so I think the more consultation protocols and accommodation protocols that we have in place, the more helpful those are, because they really set the tone of how we're going to communicate with each other to eventually get to possibly something called an IBA, which is an impact benefit agreement, which is something that we have in, obviously, Voisey's Bay. We have very strong impact benefit agreements. And then in Ontario, we're looking to say, like, do we want to do a collective agreement? What is best in class, and what is something that meets the needs of the 4 First Nation and Métis communities that we have in Sudbury, but what also then meets the needs of Vale. So, you know, working together to say, is that something that we could build together as a collective while not missing the individual rights of each community? I don't know, Lana, if you wanted to add on to sort of some of the specifics of the process.
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. But
Yeah,
let me just say this, that you know, if you are just working to do enough to be compliant or in compliance, that may not be enough to get your social license to operate. And I say that because I think, you know, with what's happening in Canada and how things are changing so rapidly, I think Indigenous people are finding their voice and better understanding how a project might impact them environmentally and socially. And so they want certain things in place. And I don't think they're being unreasonable in asking for that. But if a company is choosing, well, we're only going to do this amount of work so that we can get our permit, it may not be enough. And so I'll give you an example more specifically. So one of the companies that I do some work with have been exploring here in Canada, and now they have mineral claims in the US that they're starting to explore. But the attitude that they have taken in working with Indigenous people in Canada is now being shifted with the same kind of attitude to where they're working in the US. And so what that says to me is this company is understanding and valuing those relationships. They are not looking at the US and their laws and saying, well, we only need to do this and we only need to do that to be compliant, to be in compliance. We are going to take how we have operated successfully here in Canada and do the very same thing in the US. Now, as an Indigenous person, I was kind of chuckling to myself as I was reading the letter. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I bet you this is the first kind of letter that this community has received where a company is asking them, you know, to come to a meeting to express what their issues might be, what their concerns are. But it is the way that this company does business. So I think the world is starting to change, and people are recognizing how those relationships are so important. Now, Brazil might be a bit of a different situation in the way that has been explained earlier by Cassio. You know, the difference between small scale mining and industrial mining, and the trust that needs to develop yet between Brazil's Indigenous people and mining companies. But it has to start somewhere. So the question remains, who will be the first? Who will be the first to try to work together? What community will it be, and what mining company will it be? And that's how things start to change. When people start to see that there's a change, when things are starting to happen, and wow, I wonder how they did that. And those questions can then best be answered by that particular community or by that particular mining company. But it has to start somewhere. And so who will be the first? Who will be the first to have the courage to make the change, to go beyond what the requirements are to be in compliance, to achieve a social license to operate, and to have a true partnership?
As you want to comment as well, and if in your comment, I just wanted to add the discussion we had about the buffer zone and what Rafael just mentioned, because it's so much related to the compliance part, because in the rule, it says that you need to make the impact study if you are until 8 kilometers, right? But then some public prosecutors are using lawsuits to make this bigger. So if you could address what Rafael said and also touch on this point.
Okay, I believe there is a very important word that is respect. if the company shows respect to the communities, to their leaderships, to their governance, to their cultural way of life, it's the first step and the first condition for everything. The respect may build an agreement on how are we going to talk to each other, how are we going to relate to each other, what are the responsibilities of the companies, what are the responsibilities of the communities. And this requires trust, and we already talked about that. And this requires mutual knowledge and information and clear communication. And this requires time. Companies should be aware that to build trust and to show their respect and to build agreements with communities requires time. Newfoundland Vale took 5 years to build an agreement with the communities. So this is important. It was important for the communities to understand that it took time for the company and the community to find a common ground. So respect and time and listening and talking and giving good information. Let's talk about the buffer zone. We are talking about the Portaria 60 of 2015 that have these distances of certain projects outside of indigenous land when the company are obligated to carry a study. This is a reference, but we are talking about inside. You have a mine or hydroelectric power dam outside indigenous land, but the project have impacts inside indigenous land or over the cultural heritage and social communities. Even the projects are outside indigenous land. And if we remember Brumadinho and Mariana disaster, some indigenous community that are far away, hundreds of kilometers of these plants were affected. So, but the problem here is that this is an act for licensing processes in Brazil. But the public ministry intervened on these processes based on the lack of FPIC, free, prior, or uninformed consent. So there is a gray zone, a very complex gray zone between licensing processes, impact assessment, and free, prior, and informed consent. And how can we solve that? With trust, respect, and talk to each other. I believe that.
Cassio, I want to stay with you. We're talking a lot about relationship and trust regarding indigenous people.
Okay.
In Brazil, we have a lot of traditional communities. And I wonder if you could explore a little bit about the relevance of traditional communities in Brazil and how we can relate this discussion with traditional communities as well.
Okay, so first let's explain what we consider as traditional communities. In Brazil, we have the quilombolas, who are communities formed by former slaves that were brought from Africa as slaves to work in Brazil. There are some communities that were, how can I say, were created by some of these slaves. They run away on the forest, or they split from their owners, and they form these communities. They are recognized by Brazilian government as tribal peoples here in Brazil. So they are under the ILO 169 convention. So they have a stronger legal, how can I say, care for Brazil. But we also have some tradition, what we call traditional communities, that is a mixture of indigenous, African, Europeans, etc., that have a similar way of life regarding to indigenous. They are similar to indigenous people. But they don't have this identity. They are rubber tappers, or they live on the forest to extract Brazil nut. They may be artisanal fishermen. These communities are recognized as traditional communities here in Brazil, but they don't have the same legal assistance as indigenous and quilombolas. Okay. However, due to their strong relationship with territories, with natural resources as rivers, forests, etc., there is a trend by the public ministry to apply most of the rights that are applied to indigenous and quilombolas to traditional communities. So this is not, how can I say, defined process, still on course, but it is a trend, and I wonder that one of these days it will be, how can I say, the traditional communities will receive the same legal status than indigenous and quilombolas. But for companies, as these communities has a very different cultural way of life, companies should pay attention and have a special treatment, and if possible, apply their policies and procedures that they apply to indigenous and quilombolas. They should think about to apply to traditional communities as well.
Yeah,
even though it's more difficult to define or to identify this community because their identities is really heterogeneous.
Yeah, but then we go back to the compliance point here. I know it's not written in any law like it's written when we are talking about indigenous and quilombolas, but we are talking here about trust and relationship, and they are stakeholders and very important stakeholders. They are communities, and so I guess if we're talking about beyond compliance, trust and relationship, those words that we're using a lot in this discussion, I think that we need to pay careful attention to traditional communities as well, even though it's not written in a rule what we should do.
Certainly.
And
if the company goes to a territory, the company should know if there is indigenous, quilombola, and other kind of communities. Oh, this is a fisherman, traditional fisherman community. They depend on the river, so we have to talk to them about how they relate to the river or the forest, etc.
Yeah, correct.
You ultimately, sorry, Juliana, you ultimately have to decide what kind of company you're going to be. And if the bare minimum is acceptable to you, then you're not going to get very far. But and I think that really kind of ultimately answers it, is that if there isn't a law or a specific guidance, you have to decide what kind of company do you want to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's what I say. It's not about really the law, but how you want to where you want to put yourselves, where the company, how the company wants to have this image and its reputation. I think it's in another conversation, right? It's not about the law.
Yeah, but that's also a real challenge for, just to put my other hat on, that, that's a challenge for a lot of junior companies that are just starting out. There's a lot of resources and time, and that you probably don't have if you have very few people and you're stretched. And so that's a tough choice to make. I mean, but it is the right choice to make. And you as a company have to decide, is this something that we're really going to invest in from the beginning as we're just starting out? And in Canada, I mean, absolutely the answer is yes too, for sure. But that can be a challenge for small junior companies that are just beginning. So it's not something that I think should go unrecognized. on the company side as well, is that sometimes you don't have the dedicated resources. But I think it's just imperative that you have to find them. And that's why, yeah, there's tons of people out there to help you, obviously, like Cassio and Lana.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Victoria, you said about challenges. You also said that you are in a true reconciliation journey. And I just wrote this down. And I bet you have a lot of challenges there, right?
You do. I mean, I think it's about being really honest. Like, we have a challenge. We have a challenge in Manitoba, and we our operation in Manitoba is in a city called Thompson, Manitoba, which is about 60 to 70% of the population of Thompson, Manitoba is Indigenous. But the population of our employees does not match, and the population of our Indigenous employees does not match the city in which we operate. And that to us is not good enough. We then go above and beyond, even though we don't have an agreement in place, we are looking to build one with the First Nations that are near our operation. And but we're also, before we do that, working with a company called Working Warriors. There are specific Indigenous recruitment companies to help, again, build the capacity, the training program, so that we increase the skill level, and that we are building a community that is sustainable beyond Vale's participation there. And that's ultimately the goal, is that you are building skills that they're not dependent on Vale. They can go and work for anyone else, but ultimately you're building a skilled workforce. And that's a challenge for us in Manitoba right now. So yeah, it's not rainbows and lollipops. It shouldn't be, there's lots of work to do, and there's always going to be lots of work to do. I don't think you ever get to a point where you think, okay, well, we're perfect and we've done everything. And no, that's relationships take maintenance and they take investment. And as the needs of your company change, you should expect that the needs of the community will change too.
True. I want to open up to Lana and Cassio if you want to give us final remarks as well.
Cassio, I'll let you go first.
Okay. I think that one day small companies didn't have the knowledge to work with environmental issues. They have to learn. So I believe even junior and small companies will have to learn about how to deal with this cultural, indigenous, traditional communities issues. And I believe that thinking in a wider point of view, I believe the mining companies always say that they want to share value with the society. And this dialogue with indigenous peoples and traditional communities is a very important part of sharing values. But they will have to conduct this process in a different way compared to the rest of society, because there are some cultural, social, historical background. They are very specific. But I believe this is important for this, how can I say, responsibility of mining companies to share value with societies.
I agree with what everyone has said. And I think that it really comes down to the humanity, our humanity, whether we're on the side of mining or the side of Indigenous communities or government. And that is where the courage and the strength will come from to move forward, to create change. And, being courageous, being a person that's wanting to create a better world. Sometimes you're standing alone, and sometimes, you have to endure what others might say, and that's where the courage comes from. It's not being afraid to be the first to do something. But as long as you stand there and wait for someone else to be first so that you can be second, it might take a while. So if there's an opportunity for change, I think the change makers have to show courage to begin to make that change. So it's Victoria working for Vale, it's Cassio working in Brazil, and it's myself and the work that I do. We can't be afraid to move forward, because without people like us, without other leaders and other companies across the globe and communities, a stagnation will develop and a status quo will develop. So I think it's about moving forward now. There will never be a better time. The world is upside down, you know, with what's happening across the globe geopolitically. And we've had major weather events here in the province of BC. We had our heat dome last summer, which created all kinds of problems for people that experienced, well, I guess if you experience death, you don't experience living anymore, but a lot of people died, and it affected a lot of communities, Indigenous communities. And then we had the atmospheric rivers, and again, flooding and tremendous impact on communities, and whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous. But it began to show us how important things like climate change are to Canadians, whether we're British Columbians, whether we're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. People began to think about that more, in the same way that the discovery of the unmarked graves began to speak to people more about reconciliation, about providing opportunity and ways for Canada to move forward in working with its Indigenous peoples, and a way for Indigenous peoples to begin to move forward by being courageous, to be more vocal, and to have greater expectations of industry and of government. So I think we are in a time where great change is starting to happen. And I'm really thankful for this conversation today, to share our thoughts from different perspectives, and realize that we all really do agree that we can work together and move forward. So if it can happen here on a panel, I'm sure it can happen in our communities and in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the insights and for such an interesting discussion. I hope we can continue this dialogue and keep investing in the relationship that we have discussed here. I think the word of this discussion is relationship and trust. And I hope we can continue building this trust between companies and communities. Thank you.
Thank
Rafael,
you so much.
or Carol?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for this incredible discussion. This was very insightful, and I think I agree with Victoria. Final words, like it's also about the companies figure it out and deciding what kind of companies they want to be, right? And starting from the beginning, all right, like in the right path with the right policies in place. Definitely much easier than catching up later, because it will catch up to them eventually, right? So thank you so much. It was very, very insightful discussion. I really appreciate you guys being here. And I would like to invite then, now we have another great discussion coming up that I'm very excited about. I'd like to invite Simone, who will be moderating our next panel, Human Rights Diligence in Mining, and also invite Fadwa and Kendall to join us here. Rafael, if you wanted to add some words in terms of the subject as well, I'll pass over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. I just reiterating what we said in the opening remarks before handing over to Simone. I believe this first panel is very inspiring and will connect a lot with and to the discussion of due diligence, right? And I think we spoke in the first panel about the licensing trap and the compliance trap, and this same trap has or is set up for us when we talk about due diligence in human rights, right? Because we come from a standpoint and come with a perspective of especially, when we're talking about business and human rights, and we're talking to business people, when you talk about due diligence, you immediately think of the M&A due diligence, right? And the due diligence you do when you're doing an acquisition, and you have a checklist of matters. You go and check what is there, what is not there, what is a strength, what is a weakness, and what are the gaps and what are the costs, and then you see if you will do a good business or not, and if you're going to do profit or not. So the due diligence that we want to discuss about is what is really the due diligence in the spirit that was consolidated in the UN Guiding Principles in 2011, right? And it is extremely timely that we have this discussion, because we are experiencing a ramp up of relevance in corporations on how to treat business and human rights, and due diligence as a tool to achieve that. But then if people are approaching this from the wrong standpoint, whatever good intentions we have there may backfire and may be very negative. And the time is of essence. We have a huge opportunity in the agenda of business and human rights. We were speaking earlier, I think a little bit earlier than Simone joining us, about the relevance of this shift we are seeing in ESG, the relevance of broader stakeholders, but we specifically qualified these stakeholders called the rights holders, right? And this understanding that we insert ourselves in our business activities in a broader spectrum, in a broader context, and we are part of it and not the god of it, right? It is very important. So it's not just simple stakeholders. These are right holders in the landscape that I belong to, in the social fabric I belong to, and I need to understand how I am a part of it, how I integrate my business into it in a respectful way, in a conducive way, in a way that we leverage positive impact and that we reduce risks and above all negative impacts. So I think this is the discussion that we wanted to have from the beginning here in the SG committee of the BCCC. And I think we have a terrific panel that will be extremely capable in tackling this dimension. First of all, with the mediation, I think each panelist and the mediator here could be the keynote speaker about what I'm tackling here. So I'm really very happy to have Simone, Kendall, and Fadwa together. I think for very blessed alignments of the stars, I think these three were together in very challenging circumstances that brought very positive outcomes in terms of treatment of situations. So I think not only in the specific case that these three work together, but more broadly in all the experience they bring to the table. Simone, Kendall, with ample experience in human rights for way before the UNGPs came to the table. So I'm going to hand over to Simone for this moderation. Very happy to have these three together for this panel. So sorry to amplify and emphasize that. And Simone, over to you.
Thank you, Rafael. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Rafael and Carolina, for this invitation. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you all. And it's really a great pleasure also to share this table today with Kendo and Fadwa, two colleagues that I happen to admire quite a lot. So before I hand over to Fadwa and to Kendo, just a few brief comments that are not going to be any more enlightening than what has been already shared with you today. But indeed, we may be at a sort of a turning point in the very short history of the business and human rights agenda. We do see the pressure mounting from investors, from states, from intergovernmental organizations, from NGOs, from civil society in general. But if on the one hand, we do see more noise and more expectation and increasing normative and institutional demands, on the other hand, though, companies are still pretty much lagging behind in implementing human rights due diligence in their operations, in their commercial relations. There was a report launched recently on April 7th by OECD about reporting in mineral chain due diligence. And it showed very poor results in risk assessing and in responding to risks, which are precisely the heart of the diligence. We include risk/impacts. I mean, if you don't have that, you don't have a proper due diligence process. And this report was about, amongst other things, key human rights, serious human rights topics, and about corruption. The corporate human rights benchmark that we are all familiar with also shows very slow progress in the implementation of human rights due diligence by the major companies in the world. So at this point, it really remains to be seen whether this mounting pressure will trigger real change, or if human rights due diligence will still be cooked for a few years and with not much of a substantial result to be found. So to explore all this more in depth today, we'll hear from Kendo Salcito. Kendo is a very experienced practitioner in business and human rights, both on the ground, doing impact assessments, risk assessments, but also in policy making. And she'll bring to us some key aspects of human rights due diligence, how the process should really be built, the state of art of these expectations that we've been mentioning this morning about business and human rights, and how companies can adapt or should adapt to this reality. And then to illustrate the corporate perspective on undertaking a thorough human rights due diligence, we have Fadwa Mohammadi from Hydro, who is the lead of a very thorough and solid human rights due diligence project and process that Hydro has been undertaking in its alumina complex in Brazil in the past few years. She'll also share with us the challenges and the outcomes of this human rights due diligence exercise and how it has prepared Hydro to respond to the Norwegian legislation requirements. So I think I'll start with Fadwa. So Fadwa, please be our guest. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Rafael, Kendall, and all of you. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure for us to be here with you. I brought few slides about Hydro, and only 2 slides just to share with you how we are doing this process since 2017 here in Hydro Brazil. So I would like to share this presentation. Okay, just a second, please. So, like I said before, just to present to you or how we are here in Brazil. I work for Hydro, but in Brazil, okay, Hydro is a Norwegian company, and our operation is especially in Pará, but we have also an office in Rio de Janeiro and some other operations, extrusion operations in Itinga, Itu, and Tubarão. Today we are going to talk especially about Pará, where we started this implementation of the human rights agenda in 2018. Yes, and so just to let you know where we are presented. So Hydro has 160 years, and right now we have 31,000 employees in more than 40 countries. 8% of these employees in Brazil, 8% of these employees are from Pará state. This is one, I can start talking about how we are all the time thinking about to improve our operations with local capacity, yes, with local people. You can see in the map, I'm talking about Barcarena, which is 1.5 hours from Belém, the state capital. I'm talking also, where we have our refinery, and also we have the mining, Paragominas mining. You can see here, in a city that stays 5 hours from Belém, the state capital, or bauxite mine here, okay? We have also a pipeline which has 244 kilometers, and it passes, there are 5 municipalities along the pipeline. So in total, our territory is composed by 7 municipalities in Pará. You can see here a better map. Barcarena is here, where we have Alunorte and Albras. It's a joint venture, a primary metal company. It's a joint venture. We have here the pipeline, as you can see. It passes from Abaetetuba, Acará, Tomé-Açu, Ipixuna do Pará, and Paragominas, where we have our bauxite mine, okay? And Moju also, our pipeline comes to Moju also, okay? Just to give an idea where we are operating right now. Just one slide presenting our global strategy. We, in terms of, we are all the time aware about, we need to, of course, we are looking for profitability, but it has to be aligned to a sustainable strategy, yes? In terms of sustainability, the 3 pillars are climate, environment, and society. And social, the 3 pillars are education, support transition, it means contribute to economic and social development of the communities where the neighboring communities, and responsible supply chain. It's important to say that human rights is the key issue for us here, the key point for us here, and it conduces all of our initiatives, strategy, and actions in terms of education, support transition, and responsible supply chain, and all of us global strategy, okay? Brazil is a pillar of our global strategy. Talking about human rights, we started this process in 2011. We invited Danish Institute to provide a risk assessment in terms of human rights. In 2017, an impact mapping. So based on the results of these two movements, we decided to improve the understanding and the process in 2018. We wanted especially to understand better the territory that we operate, or impacts. I'm talking about negative and positive impacts, of course. And we hired Proactiva to support us in this due diligence and impact assessment process. It starts in the beginning of 2019, and it finished in the middle, approximately in the middle of 2020. With the participation of Simone, Kendall, Rafael, and some other experts, international and experts from Brazil also. This process was part of the CEO KPI in 2019. And today, and last year, and this year, 2021 and 2022, it is KPI of our bauxite and alumina business unit here in Brazil. Just to show you how it was conducted, we had especially 4 pillars. One is related to investigation and analysis, so more than 30 international and guides reference was analyzed, more than 300 internal documents, and now I am talking about human resources, supply chain, environmental area, health and safety, diversity and inclusion, also CSR, traditional communities. So more than 300 internal documents were assessed. We had 34 days in the field, yes, with our expert in human rights, talking to people, listening, especially listening to people. I'm including, we can include, was included communities, local government, local NGOs, employees, all of them were engaged in this whole process, yes. We had only in this first pillar, investigation and analysis, we had more than 50 interviews with the staffs, with the internal technical areas. The part of the diagnosis, based on the results of the investigation and analysis, we received 6 reports, including Indigenous and traditional communities report, because it's a very important pillar for us, because we have more than 40 quilombolas communities along our pipeline and 5 quilombolas communities in Barcarena. So it was very important to understand their realities, their perceptions, how we engage with them, and the history also, and rights. We had also 20 meetings for feedbacks on findings and recommendations to internal technical areas, and 10 meetings with our VIPs or directors to disclosure for them what we found, and also the recommendations that we are providing. At the end of the day, we have now 2 master plans, one for Hidro and another one for Albras, which I said before is our joint venture, and with due diligence and impact assessment results. Why I'm saying 2020 and 2023? Because we divided it in 3 priorities. Priority 1, 2020 and 2021, priority 2, 2021 and 2022, and priority 3, 2022 and 2023. So we finalized it last year, December last year, the first priority, which means 85% of the master plans, and we reached 95% of the implementation of the whole recommendations for priority 1. And now we are working with the priority 2, okay? And a very important point is to remember that to have this process in place and to have effective results, it's very important to have a good and strong governance, yes, and we implemented it in 2019. So we have our monitoring. This process, this whole process is to conduce this process. The CSR area is responsible to conduce this process, but we brought all the internal areas together because they have, each of them has their own action plan with findings and recommendations, okay? So we have monthly reports, we have a working group represented by the main areas involved with this process, the general managers involved in this process, which includes, like I said before, human resources, environment, health and safety, traditional communities, diversity and inclusion. So we have 12 areas working together to make it happen. And we have our steering committee, which is composed by our EVP, Brazil EVP, or some of the directors, and also EVPs from Oslo. We meet with them every 2 months to present the improvements of the agenda and also to discuss the challenges that we are facing on budget, of course, we cannot forget, and also to receive from them the whole support. And because it's very important to include, to have this support from the leadership. For this process, yes. So that's why I'm saying it's very important to have a robust governance in place and a dedicated team. Yes, today we have a human rights senior specialist working with us, which has she has a huge experience around the world, and she has worked for OIT. She has worked, not for the OIT, she has worked for UN, she has worked for some other companies, global companies. And we have another person also working with us, which we are preparing her to be a human rights specialist, and we are bringing some other 2 people to compose this human rights internal team. Yes, I'm responsible internally for this agenda, but we never do anything in terms of human rights alone. So we are increasing our team, but we are also trying to influence and also bring the internal technical areas together, okay? So this was the few slides, Simone. I finished my presentation here and I am at your disposal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fada. I think that was really clear about, the motivations to start the process and how the process actually was taken through. I would like to underline a few of the points that you raised. That I find to be particularly crucial. When you mentioned that even before you had a KPI in Oslo that pointed towards working more with more thoroughly with human rights in the operations, but also the fact that this process made new KPIs appear for other leadership in the company. So this is great because this reinforces a buy-in that if it exists prior to that, great. If it doesn't, it will need to exist from then on. So the fact that you actually link the subject and the topic to something that people tend to look at and to be concerned about, to be blunt. But yeah, this is an important point. And then the other 2 points are the governance structure. Really, it's really needed for the buy-in and for the process to be sustained until the end of the due diligence itself, but also so that it can live throughout the years from then on. And the other point also is the resources, where you said, you know, we guarantee the budget and we guarantee a team to actually walk through with the other areas of the company to implement the action plans that we know were very large and very robust, and there's a lot of work implicated in everything that needed to be done in this 3 years. So these are the points that I would like to highlight in everything you mentioned. But looking back today, Fadwa, what were the main challenges that you faced to install the process and to maintain the process alive?
Okay, Simone, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that IDRI is a signatory to the world's leading human rights organizations, yes, and our first global human rights policy was published in 2013. We review it in 2020, and now we have a commitment to review it every 2 years, yes, because we see that it's important. Because it never stops. It's not an option anymore. Yes, it's the new laws also can prove it. It's not an option. But the main challenge, it's very important to be proactive. Yes, and understand our impacts. The main challenge I can tell you, first of all, I believe influencing internally and externally. Yes, people internally and externally. These are the main challenges, and we are trying to do it with capacity building, showing them that it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be easier, if we understand and map all of our risks and opportunities before something happens. And the answer, what I can say is that the answer is what we are receiving back is an open door, yes, to discuss internally. Another challenge is to operate in the Amazon region. Yes, where we have fragile social capital, we have in the territories where we operate, we have challenges with human rights defenders, we have challenges with influencing the parts, including the local government, NGOs, and the whole society, to do it together, yes, in a participatory way, because we are only part of it. And we believe very much that our responsibility is 100% related to influence the other parts to come together to this agenda, yes? And it's not easy. Of course, it's not easy when you have a very challenging scenario, yes, in terms of education, in terms of corruption, in terms of health, and every infrastructure and everything, yes. But it's in my point of view, it will be always a learning process. We'll never know everything. That's why it's so important. Once you started it, we cannot stop anymore. Yes, that it's so important to continue doing and doing an update or due diligence process or impact assessment, to look to our role team, yes, to have a good team, to monitor the role team. It's not only about a master plan, implementation of the recommendations. We have another very, very important line of action, which is monitoring the role team in all the chains. Yes, because it happens daily. It happens daily. But in my point of view, what we are all the time discussing internally together, and we have the 100% of the support from our leadership, it's a learning process. We'll be much better next due diligence and much better in the next due diligence consequently, yes. But yes, I think these two challenges, yes, operate, influencing people, first of all, and operating in the Amazon region. But we have a lot of opportunities also, Simone. It's a place that, in my point of view, we need to look in a opportunity point of view. Yes, we need to find there more than the risks, to find the opportunity to do it together.
Right. And you talked about opportunities, and if I understand well, there were a lot of positive outputs in this process, including internal positive outputs. So do you see any lasting structural changes in the company in regards, for instance, to governance or to risk management that the human rights due diligence has brought to Hydro? Has it shaken things? Has it made some things change?
For sure, Simone. And we are very happy with this. We are very happy to see already the results, because we started in 2019, and it's a short time to see the results, but they are there. For example, the human rights agenda was included in our risk management process, including also the operational initiatives. So everything now that the decisions are all based on the human rights aspects. We can already, I can bring many examples, but we can already see engineers' process being changed based on human rights aspects that we are bringing to them. So this is one important point. Yes, another point is our global strategy. It was built and published in last January, and the human rights is the main key point for everything that we are going to do. We are going to do based on an analysis and guides related to human rights aspects. Another point is that, like I said before, yes, we can see already that we are learning very quickly. We are learning quickly. We are sharing knowledge, and not only internally, but also we are participating in strong groups, strong organizations, discussing together with peers, with communities, with government, like here today, yes. And I believe that it's we can do it better if we do it together, much better. And I'm not saying only inside Hydro. I'm saying it together with other companies, together with other peers, together with Global Compact, together with GBI, the Global Business Initiatives on Human Rights, which has 24 global companies working together, trying to find solutions together. We can see that in many aspects, we have the same challenges. So why not sharing this knowledge and try to find solutions together? So, and another, I think, another change, more engagement between internal technical areas, yes, as an important change. And also this group, now we have a strong team in Brazil working for human rights, and we now have a global group led by our head of sustainability, global head of sustainability, to discuss only human rights aspects and bringing together the other areas, supply chain, to procurement, human resource, legal, especially legal, yes. So I can see many changes, many good changes in a short time, yes.
Congratulations, this is really amazing. So I have more questions for you, but I'll wait to the end. I'll pass on the floor to Kendall. So Kendall, very glad to have you with us. Kendall, could you share with us some key aspects of the due diligence process and the state of art that you see in terms of the expectations that are now increasingly pressuring the corporate world, and how companies can adapt to this reality that tends to see, to be increasingly approaching the core of the businesses in terms of income producing and generation and so forth.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you, Fadwa, as well as the panelists immediately before this session. I feel really fortunate to be coming after such an esteemed group of speakers. It positions me really well to speak about my perspective. I love the question about sort of what is key in human rights due diligence, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what is human rights due diligence and is it just an HRIA? And Fadwa is so clear that it's not. Human rights due diligence is a comprehensive process, and sort of key components in that can be articulated sort of chronologically. You cannot do human rights due diligence without first screening your company operations for high risks. So recognizing where you need to be looking harder for adverse impacts and risks. And Hydro has done this. They've got global operations in like 50 countries or something. And they scanned their operations and identified Brazil as one of 2 or 3 countries where risks were higher. They then did a risk assessment and confirmed that those risks were likely realities. That's the work the Danish Institute did, and then commissioned an international and domestic team of human rights practitioners to carry out a detailed human rights impact assessment. And then, as Fadwa points out, it's not enough to do the risk screen, to do the risk assessment, to conduct the human rights impact assessment, because part of being duly diligent towards human rights is mitigating and remedying harms. Knowing that there are adverse impacts is not enough. It's enough in financial due diligence. It's actually enough in fiduciary due diligence, but it is not enough in human rights due diligence under the UNGPs. And so the process of implementing recommendations, monitoring whether the outcomes are more positive for rights holders is the last piece of human rights due diligence. And this is unequivocally the hardest thing about due diligence, is making sure that you're measuring your outcomes and your mitigation measures based on the experiences of affected rights holders. If the harms are perpetuated, even when your systems are better, then it's not working yet, and the process keeps going. And I don't know if now is a good time for me to sort of speak for a few minutes about sort of what that looks like on the ground. Should I go ahead with that, Simone?
Please.
Okay. I sort of wanted to talk through 4 key pieces of human rights due diligence, and specifically the field work, the human rights impact assessment and monitoring. First, getting past the politics. Second, the ways that laws can be written in opposition to human rights. Third, relationship building. And fourth, rigorously acquiring transdisciplinary knowledge. So getting past the politics, people have been so powerful and effective in how governance structures don't necessarily recognize all the indigenous peoples, all the tribal peoples who require protections. And that occurs at the national level, but it also is so prevalent at the local level, where you've got local political parties, you've got allegiances between certain business interests and certain economic activities and certain political parties. You've got alliances between NGOs and political parties. And understanding the politics nationally, internationally, regionally, locally is a part of human rights due diligence that is very uncomfortable to talk about, but is critically important for affecting change for the people who have very little control over that, for the adversely impacted, vulnerable, and marginalized rights holders. Laws can be written adverse to human rights. You know, we were so lucky to have a whole panel on Indigenous peoples immediately preceding this. There is something inherently challenging about the government of settlers defining the indigeneity of the traditional stewards of land. Brazil has this problem, Canada has this problem, the United States has this problem. The last I checked in Brazil, something like 900 Quilombola communities had sought certification more than 10 years ago, and we're still waiting to have their territories delineated. In the United States, we've registered something like 500 or 600 indigenous nations, but we have refused to recognize another 700. In Canada and the United States and Brazil, treaties will have designated specific lands to indigenous communities that are a tiny fraction of the lands they stewarded and used. And when these laws are written, they're balancing the interests of economic actors, of legislators, and to some extent indigenous communities, but they are a compromise made hundreds of years ago that are still affecting indigenous peoples today. And so adhering to law is not a feasible way to do human rights due diligence. And I'm saying those words knowing full well, I teach in a law school. I know the hazard of those words, but the legal frameworks written by settler governments are not the same as the legal frameworks that an indigenous community would establish. It's why these consultation protocols are so important. To some extent, they're the legal framework established by the indigenous community. And so recognizing that and elevating that is a key component of human rights due diligence. Building relationships, I'm so grateful that Fadwa very, very politely and diplomatically talked about this. The fact of the matter is that if you are a leading company in human rights due diligence, you have to engage with really, really crummy neighbors, neighbors that are not dedicated to human rights, businesses that have been operating for a long time without regard for human rights and do not recognize a value in spending more money to better respect local people. It means relationships with government agencies at many levels. And sometimes those relationships can really advance your efforts. In Brazil, you can build relationships with the public prosecutors to some extent, with the Palmares Foundation, with the Indigenous protection agencies, as well as with democratically elected government personnel, and of course with communities. And relationships with communities always sounds like a series of nice and pleasant meetings, but there's no community that's a monolith. I mean, on my block, there are Democrats and Republicans. There are conservationists and people who throw their aluminum cans in the trash. And that's just in my neighborhood. And so relationships with communities are incredibly complicated and time consuming and nuanced. And that's a lot of different types of relationships. And then finally, rigorously acquiring transdisciplinary knowledge. You know, Fadwa talked about human rights implications for engineering. And she talked about 120 interviews with company, community, NGOs, governments, and 300 internal documents, as well as, you know, government statistics on crime, on access to water, on health, and NGO reports. And this is because there's not inherent buy-in in companies for human rights issues. They're expensive. If protecting human rights were lucrative, we wouldn't need to safeguard it. Often it's expensive to safeguard rights. And rigorously documenting findings to demonstrate the truth of them is critically important in human rights due diligence. Without that, getting the influencing people internally, as Fadwa said, is almost impossible. You need to have the information in language that the engineers and the scientists and the managers will speak, as well as the languages that the indigenous communities and Quilombola and traditional communities will speak. So those were the 4 pieces that I really wanted to emphasize. And I feel so grateful that Fadwa made it so easy for me.
Thank you. I'm going to try to summarize, because I think we can really summarize most of what you said in 2 words, which are, or 3 words or 4 words. We have 5. We have to go beyond boundaries. And I think, if I understand well, you're talking about the legal boundaries, the legal framework. Often human rights is beyond the law. It's advancing, you know, society advances faster than the law. So this is crucial, and this is a point that's very difficult to make people understand. The borders of perceived impacts. So when we do the impacts, people want us to say, okay, you're going to look into here, and you have a timeline of 5 years ago. It doesn't work that way for human rights, right? Impacts, they have a spillover effect, and they can be brought from the past. Sometimes when you buy a company, you buy also a few problems. And this is a boundary that you also find when you do the diligence process. The boundary of the understanding of the local complexities. As you're saying, sometimes what we see is that, okay, we see this, we understand this, but it's so much deeper if you really want to understand where you're sitting and who is around you and why are they there? Why do they want you to move? And then the boundaries of relationships, very hard, as Fadwa was saying, you know, you have to go through very nice, but sometimes unpleasant meetings, and that's not gonna become a pleasant meeting unless you go through that phase. And this is a boundary that we find so often, not only within the companies, but also from the external stakeholders. Sometimes there's a lot of prejudice in these relationships. The boundaries of knowledge, the transdisciplinary nature of a human rights impact assessment. That when you, for example, yourself, who's very knowledgeable of environmental and health and safety issues, when you, a human rights expert, come with technical questions about substances that are used in production, people say, why are you asking me this? Why does it have anything to do with human rights? So, and this is something that I think you are unique. Most people don't have that full understanding, let alone the people who have to answer to your questions. And then the boundaries of documenting the findings and not hiding or, you know, locking on the drawer is something that you really wish had not happened. And as you're saying, 10 years down on the line, it's not what happened that will be brought to light, but different versions of what happened will be brought to light. And you're going to be hostage of those different versions, and you are the weak part on the truth telling, right? Or you're seen as the guilty part for default. And finally, what you pointed about the different languages, so important. And it's a challenge for the human rights people who have to understand the corporate language, because the corporate people don't necessarily, and they don't have to understand the human rights language. So you have to, as Fadwa was saying, you have to, I don't like the word educate, but you have to familiarize people with a different world of language and of understanding of the way you look at a situation. So thank you for summarizing this so well. I would like to dedicate the last 8 to 10 minutes you have, Kendall, with you, to your experience with the policy making and everything that you follow and that you contribute to all over the world in terms of how these norms and these expectations are being built, going beyond compliance in a short way of looking at compliance, going beyond the ticking box exercises. How this has been evolving, what are the main expectations, and what sort of changes companies need to undertake in order to adapt to what is coming as quite a tsunami-ish wave in the next few years?
This is a great question. There has been momentum around mandatory human rights due diligence laws, particularly in Europe and Commonwealth countries. Canada has discussed one, Australia has one, UK has one. The EU Parliament has issued a draft directive mandating European countries to have one. Germany just passed one, and Norway just passed one as well. And the earlier laws that were passed, which were primarily focused on modern slavery and forced labor, which the US and California also now have, though they're very narrow and targeted. The laws were essentially built around concepts of enterprise risk management, ERM, which companies have robust and established systems for looking at, but the risks that ERM looks at are risks to business. And there are a lot of occasions where forced labor doesn't pose a risk to business, where human rights violations don't pose a risk to business because identifying the risks is unlikely to happen. And we've seen this a lot most recently in the enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Supply Chain Act in the United States. And that's pertinent to mining because mining, smelting, alloying companies are all sourcing inputs from China and often from Xinjiang. The world's polysilicon and metallurgic silicon production is dominated by China and in particular Xinjiang, where forced labor, Uyghur forced labor is directly engaged in those facilities. And companies have used audits and supplier promises to claim that they are free of forced labor, and government propaganda from China proves them wrong. And there's a shift underway right now where those supplier promises, where those audits that are proven fraudulent are no longer working. And the German Due Diligence Act is very clear that if an activist, if an NGO, if anyone identifies an adverse human rights impact by a company's supply chain, then the company becomes liable for the harm identified. So it's not enough to paper over the risks with audits and with promises and with contracts. Actual due diligence is going to be expected going forward. And Hydro's ahead of the curve on this. You know, they've been looking at their supply chains pretty in depth for a few years now, and they've incorporated new questions around human rights. But the laws that are being drafted are a sea change. And what worked between 2010 and 2022 is going to stop working in 2023 when the German law comes into effect. And it's going to stop working when Norwegian companies start being asked to prove that what they know is different than what some independent researcher can find in a supply chain. And most companies will not be ready for that. Most companies will not have undertaken investigations into their supply chains to understand that a company that says it's based in Hebei is actually operating entirely out of Xinjiang. That a company that says it's using Dominican labor is actually using undocumented Haitian labor. And learning this is painful and it's expensive, and then solving it is even more painful and expensive. And that's what's coming. Incrementally, slowly, but as soon as it comes, it is going to feel like a tsunami. And I really hope that companies turn to their colleagues like Hydro to ask what they've done, which is not to say that Hydro's got it perfect. Like, I'm sure it's challenging, and I'm sure there are internal actors that are pushing back against this level of due diligence, probably pointing at firms to say, we're doing more than anyone else, why should we do more? But that's the direction of these laws, as independent investigators are incentivized and empowered to do the research that will expose harms.
Do you think that the certifications that we have today, for instance, in mining, are they following the trend? Because this is another way of putting pressure.
Yeah, some of them are. The IRMA certification is working hard on this. The aluminum, the ASI, Aluminum Sustainability Initiative. Stewardship, Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. I should know this. I sit on their standards committee. Don't tell Fiona. They're launching new standards this coming year that are explicit that human rights due diligence needs to be undertaken, that human rights impact assessment is necessary at new operations. So these certifications are going a long way towards this. The limitation there is that auditors only have so much time on the ground, and they can only verify and validate what they have time to see. And so for companies to rely solely on their certifications is still not going to be enough. Auditors aren't going to be able to understand the human rights risks to the extent that operators themselves understand, to the extent that the internal personnel, the FADWAs out there, will understand. So it won't be enough, but I think it's contributing.
Right. We only have a minute left, so before we leave, could you share or highlight one or two key insights to companies willing to embark in the human rights due diligence, please?
I mean, I think one that I'd really highlight is that this isn't pie in the sky. It's doable. And Fadwa, maybe you want to jump in, because I would say that Hydro's work is emblematic of the possibilities here.
Yeah, I just want to comment about ASI, for example, bringing one. I was part of the process this year, yes, and I could find how different the auditors are coming in terms of human rights. Yes, it's completely different from 2 or 3 years ago. They are much more prepared in terms of human rights, and it was the main point of the process this year. Yes, the main point. Of course, he was worried about environment, health and safety, and the engineer, but the main point that they brought this year was related to human rights aspects, including all the disciplines in the human rights umbrella. And it was a smart conversation. A very smart conversation, and we liked it so much. Of course, some other internal areas were very much surprised and worried about, but we liked it very much, because as smart as the conversation can be, yes, as much we can find solutions together, yes. And just a compliment about ASI, and we know that until the end of the year they will publish a new standard, yes, and it's going to be, in my point of view, based on what I saw, it's going to be more, it's going to be stronger. It's going to be stronger, yes. And if I can say something, Simone, I know we don't have any more time, but if I can say it doesn't matter if it's only about your business, about the whole society, about laws, certifications. In my point of view, we need to be proactive. Yes, it's going to be In few years, it's going to be less expensive. It's going to be, we'll be able to plan, yes. We'll be able to review our strategic map if we'll be proactive. And like we did, we started in 2018, and now we have a new Norwegian transparency law. We didn't know that at that time, and we are ready to answer to them. Yes, we are ready to answer to them. So if I can finalize what I'm bringing here today, I would say be proactive. Proactive. Thank you.
I'll take that as your final word. So Kendall, anything else you would like to add before we close?
No, I think that's perfect. I know we're late, and I would echo Fadwa and you. It's been such a delight to be on this panel with you both.
Thank you guys. So Rafael and Carolina, I hand it back to you, thanking you for this opportunity, which was really a pleasure.
The pleasure has been ours. Thank you so much. This was very, very insightful. So Rafa, I don't know if you wanted to share your comments on the discussion now.
I think I'm very happy with what we had. I don't think I will take the risk to add anything to it, because I think the panelists, as foreseen, did a fantastic job. Just to thank again Simone, Kendall, and Fadwa for being with us, and thank you very much for your time. And I'm sure this will be very useful to so many. So thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank you all the speakers. Lana had to leave earlier, unfortunately, but I'd like to thank you all the speakers here today for your incredible contribution, for all your insights. It's been very delightful to hear you guys speaking about such an important subject that I think has to be exposed more and has to be discussed more. So congratulations, Fadwa, congratulations, Victoria, for the incredible journey that both Hydro and Vale have in those subjects. So thank you so much for sharing your cases here with us today as well. I would like to also thank, of course, Rafael for facilitating this and for helping us to put together this incredible group of people to discuss the subject. So Rafa, thank you so much for supporting us on this discussion, and thank our sponsoring companies as well, our platinum sponsor Vale, Toronto Stock Exchange, and TSX Venture Exchange, Sescom Barrier, Baker McKenzie, Sigma Lithium Resources, and 4B Mining, our gold sponsors, Aero Copper and Aero Brazil, Export Development Canada, Wheaton Precious Metals, Equinox Gold, Yamana Gold, and Apian Capital Brazil, and our silver sponsors, Brookfield, BMA Law, Landing Mining, Jaguar Mining, Bemisa, Horizonte Minerals, Alvarez Massal, Promon Engenharia, and Kinross for their support for making this PDAC discussions possible. I would like also, of course, to thank the members of the BCCC Mining Committee, as well as Diversity and Inclusion Committee and ESG committees for the inputs, insights, and for the support. So again, thanks again for your presence. Thanks to our sponsors, our partners, our members, our volunteers, our interns, Mariana as well, for all the support. And if you wanted to learn more about the benefits of becoming a member of the BCCC, please come talk to me. Follow us on social media at Brascan Chamber, so you can be stay tuned with all the upcoming events that are taking place. So thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.